16-hour days combined intensive physical training with complex technical instruction covering ballistics, meteorology, camouflage, and fieldcraft. Many candidates struggled with the transition from conventional Marine training to the specialized skills required of snipers. Sarah approached the training with the same methodical intensity that had characterized her entire military career. While other candidates focused on trying to impress the instructors with their toughness or previous experience, Sarah concentrated on absorbing every detail of the instruction and practicing until each skill became second nature. The marksmanship portion of the training was particularly challenging because it required not just accuracy but consistency under widely varying conditions. Candidates had to demonstrate the ability to make precise shots at distances up to 1,000 meters while accounting for wind, temperature, humidity, and target movement. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Sarah's lack of extensive shooting experience initially put her at a disadvantage compared to candidates who had been competitive shooters or hunters since childhood. But she compensated for this gap by spending every available moment studying ballistics tables, practicing wind estimation, and refining her shooting technique. While other candidates relaxed during their limited free time, Sarah could be found on the range, working through problems that the instructors had presented during the day's lessons. Gunnery Sergeant Torres noticed Sarah's dedication but remained skeptical about her prospects. "Hard work is good, Martinez," he told her after observing one of her extended practice sessions, "but this program requires more than just effort. At some point, either you have the natural ability to make shots under pressure, or you don't. We'll find out which category you fall into." The first major test came during the 4th week of training, when candidates were required to successfully engage targets at various distances while operating under simulated combat conditions. The exercise involved not just marksmanship but the ability to move undetected through difficult terrain, establish concealed firing positions, and make accurate shots while under time pressure. Sarah was partnered with Corporal Jake Stevens, a veteran of 3 combat deployments who had initially been dismissive of her abilities. Stevens had been among the most vocal skeptics when Sarah was accepted into the program, privately telling other candidates that allowing women into scout sniper training would inevitably lower standards and compromise the program's effectiveness. The mission required the team to infiltrate a heavily monitored area, establish an observation post, and engage multiple targets at ranges from 400 to 800 meters. They had to accomplish this while remaining undetected by opposing forces equipped with thermal imaging and other advanced surveillance equipment. Sarah and Stevens began their infiltration before dawn, moving through thick forest terrain that required them to crawl for hours while carrying heavy equipment. The movement was physically exhausting and mentally demanding, requiring absolute silence and perfect coordination between the 2 Marines. During the approach, Stevens began to appreciate Sarah's methodical approach to fieldcraft. She moved with careful precision, testing each footstep and handhold before committing her weight. Her camouflage techniques were flawless, and her understanding of terrain features and concealment principles impressed even Stevens's veteran sensibilities. When they reached their designated firing position, Sarah and Stevens had to establish a hide site that would allow them to observe and engage their targets while remaining invisible to the opposing force. The construction of the hide required several hours of careful work, moving earth and vegetation with minimal disturbance to the surrounding area. Stevens handled the primary rifle while Sarah served as spotter, using advanced optics to identify targets and calculate firing solutions. This role required her to rapidly process complex information about distance, wind conditions, and target movement, then communicate precise adjustments to Stevens in a way that would allow him to make accurate shots under pressure. The first target appeared at 600 meters, a partially concealed figure moving through dense brush. Sarah quickly calculated the range and wind conditions, providing Stevens with the firing solution. Her calculations were precise and Stevens' shot found its mark immediately. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah and Stevens engaged 8 different targets at various ranges and under changing weather conditions. Sarah's spotting was consistently accurate, and her ability to rapidly process complex ballistic calculations under pressure impressed not only Stevens but also the instructors monitoring the exercise from concealed positions. But the real test came during the final phase of the exercise, when the opposing force began actively hunting for the sniper team. Using thermal imaging and systematic search patterns, they gradually closed in on Sarah and Stevens' position. The 2 Marines had to decide whether to abandon their mission or attempt to complete their final shots while under direct pressure. Stevens favored extraction, arguing that they had already successfully completed most of their objectives and that remaining in position posed unacceptable risks. But Sarah had identified a weakness in the opposing force's search pattern that would allow them to engage their remaining targets if they were willing to accept increased risk. "Stevens," she whispered, They're searching systematically, but they're not accounting for the thermal shadow created by that rock formation to our east. If we shift our position 15 meters and use a different firing angle, we can complete the mission and still have an escape route they won't anticipate. Stevens looked at the terrain Sarah was indicating, then at the approaching search team. Her plan was risky and required precise timing, but it was also tactically sound. Against his initial instincts, he decided to trust her judgment. The movement to the new position required them to cross open ground while the opposing force was less than 200 meters away. Sarah led the movement using micro-terrain features and natural concealment to mask their displacement. The maneuver was executed flawlessly, and they reached the new firing position without detection. From their new location, Sarah spotted two final targets at extreme range, over 900 meters away and partially concealed by vegetation. The shots were at the very limit of the weapon system's capability and required perfect execution under the pressure of knowing that the opposing force was still actively searching for them. Stevens took the first shot, guided by Sarah's calculations, and watched through his scope as the target immediately fell. The second shot was even more challenging, requiring adjustment for a target that was moving laterally across their field of view. Sarah provided the lead calculation and wind correction, and Stevens squeezed the trigger with the smooth precision that characterized expert marksmanship. The shot was perfect, and both Marines immediately began their planned extraction before the opposing force could triangulate their position. The successful completion of this exercise marked a turning point in how the instructors viewed Sarah's potential. Gunnery Sergeant Torres, who had been watching the exercise through long-range optics, was forced to admit that Sarah's performance had exceeded his expectations in every measurable way. "Martinez," Torres said during the after-action review, "what you accomplished today was exceptional shooting and spotting. But more importantly, your tactical thinking under pressure showed the kind of judgment we need in our most demanding missions." He paused, studying her carefully. "Stevens, what's your assessment of Martinez as a team member?" Stevens, who had begun the exercise skeptical of Sarah's capabilities, was unequivocal in his praise. "Gunny, Martinez is one of the best spotters I've ever worked with. Her calculations were consistently accurate, her tactical suggestions were sound, and she remained calm under pressure that would have rattled Marines with years more experience." As the training progressed through its final weeks, Sarah continued to exceed expectations in every phase of instruction. Her scores on written examinations were consistently among the highest in her class, and her practical performance in field exercises demonstrated a level of proficiency that impressed even the most experienced instructors. But it was during the final graduation exercise that Sarah truly distinguished herself. The scenario involved a complex mission requiring teams to operate independently in hostile territory for 72 hours while completing multiple objectives under extreme conditions. The exercise was designed to test everything the candidates had learned during their 16 weeks of training. Sarah was paired with Sergeant First Class David Kim, a highly experienced Marine who had specifically requested to work with her based on her performance in previous exercises. Their mission required them to infiltrate enemy territory, establish multiple observation posts, gather intelligence on enemy movements, and engage high-value targets when opportunities presented themselves. The mission area was a 50-square-kilometer section of Virginia wilderness that had been configured to simulate the mountainous terrain where Marine snipers might operate in actual combat. Opposing forces equipped with advanced detection equipment were actively patrolling the area, and the weather conditions were deliberately challenging, with cold temperatures and intermittent rain that made movement and concealment more difficult. Sarah and Kim began their mission at nightfall, using night vision equipment to navigate through the difficult terrain toward their first objective. The movement required over 8 hours of careful navigation through thick forest and steep terrain while avoiding detection by multiple enemy patrols. During the infiltration, Sarah demonstrated fieldcraft skills that impressed even Kim, who had operated in similar conditions during actual combat deployments. Her movement techniques were virtually silent, her camouflage was expertly applied, and her navigation was precise enough to bring them within meters of their intended destination despite the challenging conditions. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Kim established 4 different observation posts, documented detailed intelligence about enemy movements and positions, and successfully engaged 6 high-value targets at ranges from 500 to 100 meters. Throughout the exercise, Sarah served as primary spotter, while Kim handled the rifle. But her tactical planning and decision-making drove many of their most successful operations. On the final day of the exercise, Sarah and Kim were presented with an opportunity that would test their skills to the absolute limit. Intelligence indicated that a high-value target would be moving through their area of operations, but engaging the target would require them to operate at extreme range, over 1,300 meters, under difficult weather conditions. The shot was at the very edge of what was technically possible with their weapon system, and the weather conditions made accurate shooting extremely challenging. Sarah spent over an hour calculating the firing solution, using every technique she had learned during training to account for the extreme range, gusty crosswinds, and temperature variations. When the target finally appeared, Sarah's calculations proved to be perfect. Kim's shot, guided by Sarah's spotting, found its mark at a distance that pushed the boundaries of precision marksmanship. The successful engagement was observed by instructors who later described it as one of the most technically challenging shots they had ever witnessed during a training exercise. When Sarah graduated from Scout Sniper School 6 weeks later, she had achieved the highest overall scores in her class and had earned the respect of instructors who had initially doubted her suitability for the program. Gunnery Sergeant Torres, in his graduation address, specifically mentioned Sarah's performance as an example of how dedication and systematic thinking could overcome any perceived disadvantages. But even as Sarah celebrated this achievement, she knew that her real test was still ahead. Scout Sniper School had prepared her for combat, but it hadn't been combat itself. That test would come sooner than she expected, in a deployment that would put all her training to the ultimate test and establish her reputation as one of the most formidable Marines of her generation. 3 months after graduation, Sarah received orders for deployment to Afghanistan, where she would be assigned to a forward operating base in one of the most dangerous regions of the country. The mission would require her to operate in an environment where the skills she had learned at Quantico would mean the difference between life and death, not just for herself but for the Marines who would depend on her expertise to keep them safe. As Sarah prepared for deployment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years earlier, she had been a logistics coordinator with no combat experience. Now, she was a highly trained sniper preparing for deployment to one of the most challenging combat environments in the world. But despite all her training and preparation, Sarah knew that real combat would present challenges that no training exercise could fully simulate. What she didn't know was that her deployment would include a mission that would test not just her technical skills as a sniper, but her ability to make decisions under pressure that would save lives and earn her recognition as one of the most exceptional warriors the Marine Corps had ever produced. Forward Operating Base Thunder, located in Afghanistan's volatile Helmand province, was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and defensive positions carved out of harsh desert terrain. When Sarah arrived for her first combat deployment, the base was home to 800 Marines tasked with maintaining security in an area where Taliban insurgents had been increasingly active. Colonel Patricia Williams, the base commander, had reviewed Sarah's training records before her arrival and was curious to see how this young Marine would perform under actual combat conditions. Williams had been one of the first female Marines to command a combat unit, and she understood the unique pressures that Sarah would face as a woman in a traditionally male-dominated role. "Martinez," Colonel Williams said during their initial meeting, "your training scores are exceptional, but combat is different from any exercise you've experienced. The enemy shoots back, mistakes have permanent consequences, and the stress is unlike anything you can simulate in training. How do you think you'll handle that reality?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, I understand that combat will be more challenging than training, but I also know that the fundamental skills remain the same. Accurate shooting, tactical thinking, and working effectively as part of a team. I'm prepared to learn from the Marines around me who have combat experience, and I'm committed to performing at the highest standard." Colonel Williams nodded, impressed by Sarah's straightforward assessment. "You'll be working with Staff Sergeant Michael Chen's Scout Sniper team. Chen has 3 combat deployments and knows this area better than anyone. Listen to him, learn from him, and prove yourself through your actions rather than your words." Staff Sergeant Chen had been briefed about Sarah's arrival and was skeptical about integrating a Marine with no combat experience into his highly effective team. Chen's previous spotter had been wounded in action 6 weeks earlier, and he had been operating with temporary partners who lacked the specialized training required for complex sniper operations. "Martinez," Chen said when Sarah reported to his team, "forget everything you think you know about being a sniper. Training is one thing. Combat is completely different. You're going to start by observing and learning. Don't try to be a hero, don't take unnecessary risks, and don't make assumptions about anything." Sarah's first month at FOB Thunder involved patrol operations, base security, and observation missions that allowed her to acclimate to the combat environment without taking on primary responsibilities. She studied the local terrain, learned about enemy tactics and patterns, and gradually earned the respect of Chen's team through her professionalism and careful attention to detail. The area around FOB Thunder was characterized by rugged mountains, narrow valleys, and small villages where the line between civilians and insurgents was often unclear. Taliban fighters used the complex terrain to stage attacks on coalition forces, then disappear into hidden positions that were extremely difficult to locate and neutralize. During her 6-week in country, Sarah participated in her first major combat operation. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a remote mountain village, and Sarah's sniper team was tasked with providing overwatch for an assault force attempting to capture the target. The mission required Sarah and Chen to establish an observation post on a mountainside overlooking the target village, from where they could provide intelligence about enemy movements and engage threats to the assault force if necessary. The position was over 2 kilometers from the village, requiring shots at extreme range if engagement became necessary. Sarah and Chen began their movement to the observation post at midnight, using night vision equipment to navigate through terrain that was both treacherous and closely monitored by enemy forces.
The climb to their position required 6 hours of careful movement through loose rock and steep terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. When they reached their designated position, Sarah and Chen spent several hours establishing a concealed hide site that would allow them to observe the village while remaining invisible to enemy forces.
Sarah's camouflage techniques, refined through months of training, proved effective in the harsh desert environment. As dawn broke, Sarah began systematic observation of the target village, using high-powered optics to identify and catalog every person and structure within their field of view. Her detailed notes and sketches provided valuable intelligence about the layout of the village and the patterns of movement by potential insurgents. At 0807 hours, Sarah spotted movement that immediately caught her attention. A group of armed men was establishing what appeared to be a defensive position on the roof of a building that commanded the only approach route the assault force could use to reach the village. The position would allow the insurgents to devastating effect against Marines attempting to enter the village. "Chen," Sarah whispered, "I've got armed personnel establishing a fighting position on the roof of Building 7, range approximately 1,850 meters.
They're positioning what looks like a heavy machine gun." Chen studied the target through his scope, confirming Sarah's assessment.
The distance was at the extreme edge of their weapon system's effective range, and the shot would be technically challenging even under ideal conditions. But if the insurgents were allowed to establish their position, the assault force would face devastating fire when they attempted to enter the village.
"That's a long shot in these conditions," Chen said quietly. "Winds gusting, temperatures rising, and the target's partially concealed."
"But if we don't take it, those Marines are going to walk into a kill zone." Sarah immediately began calculating the firing solution, using every technique she had learned during training to account for the extreme range and challenging environmental conditions.
The shot would require precise adjustments for wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, and the elevation difference between their position and the target. After several minutes of careful calculation, Sarah provided Chen with the firing solution. Elevation up 4 minutes of angle, wind left 2 minutes, target moving slowly left to right. Hold for center mass, slight lead for movement.
Chen adjusted his rifle according to Sarah's calculations and settled into his firing position. Through her spotting scope, Sarah watched the target area carefully, waiting for the optimal moment when the insurgent would be fully exposed and stationary.
"Target exposed," Sarah whispered. "Wind steady at 12 miles per hour from the left. Range 1847 meters. Send it."
Chen's shot was perfect. The bullet traveled for over 2 seconds before finding its target, immediately neutralizing the threat to the assault force.
The other insurgents on the rooftop scattered, abandoning their defensive position and eliminating the immediate danger to the Marines below. "Outstanding shot," Sarah said quietly.
Target down, threat neutralized. But even as Chen acknowledged her spotting, Sarah was already scanning for additional threats. Her systematic observation identified 2 more potential firing positions where insurgents might attempt to establish defensive positions, and she maintained continuous surveillance of these areas throughout the operation. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah and Chen provided crucial intelligence and fire support for the assault force. Sarah's detailed observations allowed the Marines below to avoid several potential ambush sites, and her accurate spotting enabled Chen to neutralize 3 additional threats at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The mission concluded successfully with the capture of the target and minimal casualties among coalition forces. During the after-action review, the assault force commander specifically praised the effectiveness of Sarah and Chen's overwatch, noting that their intelligence and fire support had been crucial to the operation's success. Colonel Williams, who had monitored the operation from the base command center, requested a meeting with Sarah following the mission.
"Martinez," she said, "the reports from today's operation are extremely positive. Your spotting was accurate, your tactical awareness was exceptional, and your performance under pressure impressed everyone involved."
Sarah remained modest about her contribution.
"Thank you, ma'am. Staff Sergeant Chen did the shooting. I just helped with the calculations." Williams smiled slightly. "Martinez, effective spotting is one of the most demanding skills in the military. What you did today, making accurate calculations at extreme range under combat pressure, requires a level of technical expertise and mental toughness that very few Marines possess. Over the following months, Sarah and Chen conducted dozens of similar missions, establishing a reputation as one of the most effective sniper teams in the region.
Sarah's technical skills continued to improve through practical experience, and her tactical judgment matured rapidly under Chen's mentorship. But it was during a mission in her 4th month of deployment that Sarah faced her greatest test, and earned the recognition that would make her legendary throughout the Marine Corps.
Intelligence had indicated that a major Taliban leader was planning a large-scale attack on Fob Thunder, and Sarah's team was tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission to locate and neutralize the threat. The mission area was a valley system 20 kilometers from the base, known to be heavily defended and frequently patrolled by insurgent forces. Previous reconnaissance attempts had failed due to the challenging terrain and heavy enemy presence. But the intelligence about the planned attack was considered reliable enough to justify the risk. Sarah and Chen, along with 2 additional Marines providing security, began their mission under cover of darkness. The infiltration required them to cross enemy-controlled territory and establish an observation post in a location that would allow them to monitor a suspected enemy staging area. The movement to the target area took over 12 hours and required the team to avoid multiple enemy patrols while crossing terrain that offered limited concealment. Sarah's navigation and fieldcraft skills proved crucial during the infiltration, helping the team reach their destination without detection. Once in position, Sarah began the systematic observation that would continue for the next 18 hours.
Using advanced optics and technical surveillance equipment, she documented detailed intelligence about enemy movements, positions, and apparent preparations for a major operation. During the 2nd day of observation, Sarah identified what appeared to be a gathering of high-value targets in a compound approximately 2,000 meters from their position.
The individuals appeared to be conducting a planning session for what intelligence later confirmed was the planned attack on FOB Thunder. The engagement would require a shot at extreme range under difficult conditions, but the opportunity to neutralize multiple high-value targets was too important to pass up.
Sarah spent over an hour calculating the firing solution, accounting for all environmental factors, and the technical challenges of the shot. Chen prepared for what would be one of the most technically demanding shots of his career, relying entirely on Sarah's calculations and spotting. The target was partially concealed, the range was at the absolute limit of their weapon system, and the environmental conditions were challenging. Range 2,047 meters, Sarah whispered. Elevation up 6 minutes, wind right 3 minutes. Target is the individual in the center of the group, wearing dark clothing. Slight movement, so watch for timing. Chen's shot, guided by Sarah's precise calculations, successfully engaged the target at extreme range. The immediate result was chaos in the enemy compound, with insurgents scattering and abandoning their planning session. Intelligence later confirmed that the target had been a senior Taliban commander whose elimination significantly disrupted planned attacks in the region. But the successful shot also revealed the sniper team's position to enemy forces, who began an immediate search operation designed to locate and eliminate the Marines. Sarah and Chen found themselves trapped in their observation post, surrounded by enemy forces conducting a systematic search of the area. What followed was a 36-hour ordeal that tested every aspect of Sarah's training and mental toughness. Cut off from support and surrounded by enemy forces, the sniper team had to remain concealed while maintaining the ability to defend themselves if discovered. Sarah's fieldcraft skills proved crucial during this period. Her camouflage techniques and understanding of concealment principles kept the team hidden despite intensive enemy search efforts that passed within meters of their position. 6 months later, when Sarah completed her deployment and returned to the United States, she carried with her not just the respect of every Marine she had served with, but also a reputation that had spread throughout the Corps. Stories of her marksmanship, tactical abilities, and courage under pressure had become the stuff of legend among Marines who understood the extraordinary difficulty of what she had accomplished. Staff Sergeant Chen, in his final efficiency report on Sarah's performance, wrote, "Marine Martinez represents the absolute pinnacle of professional excellence. Her technical abilities, tactical judgment, and personal character make her one of the most exceptional Marines I have had the privilege of serving with. The Marine Corps should consider her for its most demanding and important missions." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Colonel Williams, who had observed Sarah's entire deployment. "Martinez," she said during their final meeting, "when you first arrived, I wondered how you would handle combat. Now I know. You didn't just handle it. You excelled at it in ways that will be remembered for years to come. We see chance. You've proven that excellence has no gender, no background requirements, and no prerequisites other than character and determination." As Sarah prepared to return home, She reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small farming town to recognition as one of the Marine Corps' most exceptional warriors.
The girl who had been ridiculed for her worn-out shoes and quiet manner had become a legend among the toughest Marines in the world. But more importantly, she had proven that strength came in many forms, that excellence was defined not by traditional expectations but by results, and that the most unlikely people could achieve the most extraordinary things when given the opportunity to prove themselves.
The Marine Corps had gained not just an exceptional sniper, but a symbol of what was possible when talent, determination, and opportunity came together. Sarah Martinez had become proof that sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be exactly the person everyone needs. Her ability to remain motionless and silent for extended periods, combined with her tactical awareness, prevented detection when discovery would have meant certain death. When the team finally extracted after the enemy search was called off, they had gathered intelligence that led to the disruption of multiple planned attacks and the identification of several previously unknown enemy positions. Their mission was hailed as one of the most successful reconnaissance operations conducted in the region. The recognition that followed this mission established Sarah's reputation throughout the Marine Corps.
General Robert Hayes, commanding all Marine forces in Afghanistan, personally reviewed the after-action reports and was impressed enough to request a meeting with Sarah during his next visit to Fob Thunder. Marine Martinez, General Hayes said during their meeting, "What you accomplished during that mission represents the highest standards of Marine Corps professionalism.
Your technical skills, tactical judgment, and personal courage under extreme pressure exemplify everything we expect from our most elite warriors." Sarah, overwhelmed by recognition from such a senior officer, managed to respond professionally.
"Thank you, General. I was fortunate to work with an exceptional team and to serve alongside Marines who made the mission possible." General Hayes smiled at her modesty.
"Martinez, false humility doesn't serve anyone. What you did was exceptional by any standard, and the Marine Corps needs to recognize and learn from exceptional performance." He paused, studying her carefully. "When your deployment ends, I want you to consider applying for even more specialized training. The Corps has missions that require your particular combination of skills and judgment." When they finally reached the attack position, Sarah's team was perfectly positioned to assault the enemy stronghold from its most vulnerable angle. The simulated attack that followed was swift and decisive, with Sarah coordinating her team's movements with the precision of a veteran small unit leader. The opposing force was completely surprised and quickly overwhelmed, allowing the convoy to complete its mission successfully. After the exercise concluded, the senior Marines conducting the evaluation were effusive in their praise for Sarah's performance. Captain Morrison, who had observed the entire operation, requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss what he had witnessed. "Marine Martinez," Morrison began, settling behind his desk in a way that suggested this was going to be a significant conversation. "What you did today was exceptional. Not just good, not just impressive, exceptional. I've seen Marines with years of combat experience who couldn't have planned and executed what you did." Sarah sat at attention, unsure how to respond to praise that seemed far beyond what she deserved. "Thank you, sir. I just tried to think through the problem systematically." Morrison leaned forward. "That's exactly what I want to talk about. Your ability to analyze complex tactical situations and develop creative solutions is exactly the kind of skill the Corps needs for its most challenging missions." He paused, studying Sarah carefully. "How would you feel about applying for specialized training? There are opportunities for Marines who show your particular talents." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of specialized training, sir?" "Scout Sniper School, for starters. Advanced infantry tactics. Eventually, if you prove yourself, there are even more specialized programs." Morrison pulled out a file folder and placed it on the desk between them. "These programs are extremely demanding, both physically and mentally. The failure rate is high and the standards are uncompromising. But for Marines who succeed, they represent the highest level of military professionalism." Sarah looked at the folder, knowing that whatever was inside would represent a dramatic change in her military career. Scout snipers were among the most elite Marines in the Corps, requiring skills and training that went far beyond what she had learned so far. The physical demands alone would be extraordinary, and the mental pressure would be unlike anything she had experienced. "Sir," she said carefully, "can I ask why you're offering this to me? I know there are Marines with more experience, more traditional qualifications." Morrison smiled slightly. "Because experience isn't everything, Martinez. What you showed today, the ability to think clearly under pressure, to see tactical solutions that others miss, to lead by example rather than rank, those are qualities that can't be taught. They can be refined and developed, but they have to exist naturally first." Over the following weeks, Sarah underwent a series of evaluations designed to assess her suitability for advanced training. She was tested on marksmanship, physical fitness, land navigation, and tactical knowledge. Each test was designed to push her to her limits and identify any weaknesses that might make her unsuitable for the demanding training ahead. The marksmanship evaluation was particularly challenging for Sarah, not because she lacked natural ability, but because she had never had access to the kind of extensive firearms training that many of her male counterparts took for granted. While other candidates had been hunting and shooting since childhood, Sarah had learned to shoot only during basic training at boot camp.
But what she lacked in experience, she made up for, with the same methodical approach that had served her well in other areas. She studied ballistics and wind reading with the intensity of a graduate student, spending her free time at the firing range until her shooting became not just competent, but exceptional.
The physical fitness standards for scout sniper training were brutal, designed to eliminate candidates who might fail under the extreme conditions they would face in combat. Sarah had to prove she could carry heavy equipment over long distances, operate effectively on minimal sleep and food, and maintain peak performance under sustained stress.
But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the evaluation process was the psychological assessment. Military psychologists put Sarah through a battery of tests designed to evaluate her mental toughness, decision-making abilities under pressure, and capacity to function effectively in high-stress situations. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the psychologist conducting Sarah's evaluation, had assessed hundreds of candidates for specialized military training.
She was struck by Sarah's combination of quiet confidence and analytical thinking, but also by something less tangible, a quality of resilience that seemed almost unshakable. "Tell me about a time when you faced a situation that seemed impossible, Doctor," Warren said during one of their sessions. "How did you handle it?" Sarah thought for a moment, then told her about the night during her sophomore year of high school, when her youngest brother had suffered a severe asthma attack while her parents were both working late shifts. The nearest hospital was 15 miles away, the family car wouldn't start, and calling an ambulance would have meant a bill they couldn't afford. "I called a neighbor who agreed to drive us, but his car only seated 2 people, Sarah explained. "So I had to make a choice between staying home with my other siblings or going to the hospital with my brother. I decided to go to the hospital, but first I called my oldest sister at work and convinced her employer to let her leave early to come home. Then I prepared a detailed list of instructions for my other siblings, including emergency contact numbers and what to do if any other problems arose." Dr. Warren made notes as Sarah continued. "At the hospital, I had to navigate the insurance paperwork, translate for my brother when the doctors asked questions, and coordinate with my parents by phone to make medical decisions. The whole time I was terrified that something terrible was going to happen, but I knew that panicking wouldn't help anyone." "How did it turn out, Doctor?" Warren asked. "My brother was fine. The doctors said we had gotten him there just in time and he responded well to treatment. But what I learned that night was that I could handle crisis situations by breaking them down into manageable pieces and addressing each piece systematically. I also learned that sometimes leadership means making difficult decisions when nobody else is in a position to make them, Doctor." Warren set down her pen and looked at Sarah directly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in our most demanding roles."
You understand that leadership isn't about being the loudest person in the room or the most aggressive. It's about being the person who can think clearly when everyone else is panicking.
2 weeks later, Sarah received notification that she had been accepted for scout sniper training at the Marine Corps base Quantico. The letter came with a warning that the 16-week course had a failure rate of over 60%, and that she should be prepared for the most challenging training she had ever experienced. As Sarah packed her gear for the move to Quantico, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 18 months ago, she had been a high school student in a small farming town, helping her parents make ends meet and dreaming of becoming a nurse. Now she was preparing for training that would transform her into one of the most elite warriors in the United States military. But even as she prepared for this next challenge, Sarah had no way of knowing that her greatest test was still ahead of her. The training at Quantico would push her to her limits and beyond, but it would also prepare her for a deployment that would put her skills to the ultimate test and establish her reputation as one of the most formidable Marines of her generation. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico was designed to break down even the most confident Marines and rebuild them into precision instruments of warfare. When Sarah arrived at the facility, she immediately understood that she was entering a completely different level of military training. The other candidates were all seasoned Marines, most with multiple deployments and combat experience that dwarfed her own limited background.
Chief Instructor Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres had been running scout sniper training for 8 years and had seen every type of candidate imaginable. When he reviewed Sarah's file before the course began, he was skeptical about her chances of success. She was smaller than any candidate he had ever accepted, had no previous sniper training, and came from a logistics background rather than infantry. In his experience, Scout Sniper School required not just physical and mental toughness, but a specific kind of aggressive mindset that he doubted this quiet young woman possessed. The first week of training was designed to eliminate candidates who lacked the basic physical and mental requirements for the program. Everyone ridiculed her skills, until the Marine general hailed her as a legend. Picture this: a small-town girl who could barely afford proper running shoes, standing on a military training field, surrounded by the toughest Marines in the country. They're all laughing, pointing at her worn-out sneakers and oversized uniform. The drill sergeant shakes his head in disbelief. "This is what they sent us?" he mutters under his breath. But what they didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary young woman possessed something that couldn't be taught in any military academy or bought with money. Something that would soon turn their mockery into stunned silence, their doubt into respect, and eventually transform her from the laughingstock of the base into a living legend whose name would be whispered with reverence in military circles for decades to come. This is the story of how the most underestimated person in the room became the most feared warrior the Marines had ever seen, proving that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most unexpected places. Sarah Martinez had never imagined she would find herself standing at the gates of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton at 5 a.m, clutching a worn duffel bag that contained everything she owned. The fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, creating an eerie atmosphere that matched her nervous energy. She was 19 years old, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed less than most of the gear the Marines carried on a regular training exercise. Growing up in the small agricultural town of Delano, California, Sarah had learned about hardship early. Her father, Miguel, worked 16-hour days in the grape fields, his hands permanently stained from years of labor under the scorching Central Valley sun. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses for wealthy families in Bakersfield, often working 7 days a week just to keep food on the table. The Martinez family lived paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes not even that. Sarah's childhood was defined by responsibility far beyond her years. While other kids played video games or hung out at the mall, she was helping her parents with her 3 younger siblings, making sure they had clean clothes for school.
She learned to stretch $1 like it was made of elastic, turning leftover rice and beans into 5 different meals throughout the week. Her sneakers had holes in them for most of her sophomore year of high school because new shoes meant less money for her little brother's asthma medication. Despite the financial struggles, Sarah's parents had instilled in her an unshakable work ethic. "Mija," her father would say, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke. "We may not have money, but we have our dignity. We work hard, we don't give up, and we always do what's right." These words became Sarah's personal motto, even when life seemed determined to test her resolve at every turn. What? In high school, Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for athletics, but not in the traditional sense. She wasn't the fastest runner on the track team, nor was she the strongest player on any sports team. What she had was something much rarer, an almost supernatural ability to endure. While other students complained about running a single mile in PE class, Sarah found herself oddly energized by physical challenges that left her classmates gasping for breath. Her PE teacher, Coach Anderson, noticed this unusual quality during a particularly grueling fitness test. While other students dropped out one by one during a continuous running assessment, Sarah just kept going. Her breathing remained steady, her pace consistent, even as sweat poured down her face. "Martinez," Coach Anderson called out after everyone else had quit, "you can stop now." The test ended 10 minutes ago. Sarah looked genuinely surprised. She hadn't even realized she was the only one still running. This discovery led to Sarah joining the cross-country team. Despite not owning proper running shoes, she ran in her worn-out sneakers, the soles so thin she could feel every pebble on the track. Her teammates, mostly middle-class kids with expensive gear and personal trainers, initially felt sorry for her. But that pity quickly turned to amazement, then to something approaching awe. During her junior year, Sarah participated in a regional endurance challenge that had been designed by a retired Marine colonel who wanted to test the mental toughness of local high school athletes. The challenge involved carrying a 40-pound backpack over a 15-mile course that included steep hills, creek crossings, and obstacle courses. Most participants were football players and wrestlers, boys who outweighed Sarah by 50 to 70 pounds. The course began at dawn, and within the first 5 miles, half the participants had dropped out. The weight of the backpack combined with the difficult terrain proved too much for many of these strong, athletic teenagers. But Sarah pressed on, her face a mask of quiet determination. She had spent years carrying heavy bags of groceries home from the store, walking miles because the family car was unreliable. This was just another Tuesday for her. By mile 10, only 8 participants remained, and Sarah was keeping pace with boys who towered over her. The other remaining contestants began to notice this small girl who never seemed to tire, who never complained, who just kept putting one foot in front of the other with mechanical precision. Some of them started to get frustrated, then angry. How was this skinny girl making them look bad? At mile 13, something remarkable happened. One of the larger boys, a star football player named Brad, who was being recruited by several colleges, suddenly stumbled and fell. His ankle had twisted badly on a loose rock, and he was clearly in pain. The other competitors hesitated, not sure whether to help or continue toward the finish line and potential scholarships. Sarah didn't hesitate. She immediately dropped her backpack and knelt beside Brad, assessing his injury with a calmness that belied her age. She had learned basic first aid, helping care for her siblings, and from volunteering at a local clinic. "Your ankle's not broken, but it's badly sprained," she told him matter-of-factly. "You can't put weight on it." What happened next would be talked about in the local community for years. Without being asked, Sarah helped Brad to his feet and let him lean on her shoulder. The finish line was still 2 miles away, all uphill, and her own backpack was still waiting to be carried. But Sarah shouldered both packs and began the slow, difficult journey of essentially carrying a boy who weighed almost twice as much as she did. The other competitors had long since finished the race. When Sarah finally appeared at the top of the final hill, Brad still leaning heavily on her shoulder, both backpacks weighing her down. The Marine colonel who had designed the challenge was waiting at the finish line, and his expression was unreadable as he watched this tiny girl complete what many grown Marines would have considered a challenging exercise. "Son," the colonel said to Brad after Sarah had helped him across the finish line, "you better remember this day for the rest of your life. That young lady just showed you what real strength looks like." Then he turned to Sarah, who was quietly sitting on a rock, finally allowing herself to catch her breath. "What's your name, miss?" "Sarah Martinez, sir," she replied, unconsciously straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. "Sarah Martinez," the colonel repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Tell me, what are your plans after graduation?" Sarah looked down at her worn shoes, suddenly aware of how she must look to this distinguished military officer. "I'm hoping to get a scholarship, sir." "My family can't afford college, but I want to study to become a nurse. I want to help people." The colonel nodded slowly. "You know, the Marine Corps is always looking for people who understand what service really means. People who put others before themselves. People who don't quit when things get tough." He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Sarah. "If you're interested in serving your country while getting that education you want, give me a call." Sarah stared at the card, reading the words United States Marine Corps Recruiter beneath the colonel's name. The idea had never occurred to her before. Girls from families like hers didn't become Marines. They got jobs at the local grocery store or, if they were lucky, community college degrees that led to slightly better jobs. The military seemed like something for other people, people who had more options, more confidence, more everything. But as she sat there, still breathing hard from the most challenging physical test of her life, something shifted in Sarah's mind. Maybe there was another path, one that would allow her to serve others while building a better life for herself and her family. Maybe being underestimated wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was an advantage. 3 months later, Sarah found herself signing enlistment papers at the Marine recruiting station in Bakersfield. Her parents were worried but supportive, understanding that this might be their daughter's best chance at a different kind of life. Her father shook hands with the recruiter, his calloused palm evidence of his own lifelong service to his family. "Take care of my daughter," he said simply. "She's tougher than she looks." The recruiter, who had been doing his job for over a decade, smiled politely but privately doubted that this soft-spoken girl from the farm worker community would make it through the first week of boot camp. He had seen hundreds of recruits come and go, and Sarah Martinez didn't fit the profile of a typical Marine success story. She was too small, too quiet, too different from the aggressive, confident young men who usually thrived in military culture. He had no way of knowing that he was looking at someone who would redefine what it meant to be a Marine. As Sarah boarded the bus that would take her to boot camp at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego,
She carried with her the lessons learned from years of struggle, that strength wasn't about size or volume, that endurance was a choice you made every day, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against the voice in your own head that whispered you weren't good enough. The bus pulled away from the station as the sun set over the Central Valley, carrying Sarah toward a future she couldn't imagine.
Behind her, she left a family that loved her but didn't understand her choice. Ahead of her lay 13 weeks of the most challenging training the United States military had to offer, designed to break down civilian recruits and rebuild them as Marines. What the drill instructors at boot camp couldn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been rebuilding herself her entire life. The yellow footprints painted on the asphalt at Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego had seen thousands of nervous recruits take their first official steps toward becoming Marines. When Sarah stepped onto those footprints at 3 a.m, she was immediately struck by how small and insignificant she felt. Around her, 59 other recruits stood at attention, most of them young men who looked like they had been lifting weights since middle school. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man whose voice could apparently shatter glass, began his welcome speech. Listen up, recruits. For the next 13 weeks, your pathetic civilian lives are over. You belong to me now, and I am going to transform you maggots into United States Marines, or I'm going to break you trying. His eyes scanned the formation, lingering for a moment on Sarah with what she interpreted as skepticism. The first week of boot camp was designed to shock recruits out of their civilian mindset, and for Sarah, the adjustment was particularly jarring. She had never been yelled at with such intensity, never been pushed to respond with immediate, unquestioning obedience. The drill instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in singling out recruits who looked like they might not belong.
Martinez. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the humid San Diego morning air during their first physical training session. What do you think this is? Summer camp?
Drop and give me 20 push-ups. Now. Sarah dropped to the position and began her push-ups, her form perfect despite her fatigue.
What surprised the drill instructor was that she completed all 20 without the shaking arms and labored breathing that characterized most recruits at this stage of training. Her face remained calm, focused, as if she were simply completing another routine task.
Not bad, Rodriguez muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Sarah to hear. Let's see how you do with 50. 50 push-ups later, Sarah rose to her feet and returned to attention, her breathing only slightly elevated.
Around her, several male recruits who had been snickering at the little girl suddenly found their own workout routines much more challenging.
They had expected to watch her fail spectacularly, providing them with entertainment and a sense of superiority. Instead, they were witnessing something that made them deeply uncomfortable, the possibility that their assumptions about strength and capability were completely wrong.
The snickering turned to whispers, and the whispers carried an edge of resentment that Sarah couldn't ignore. During chow time, she would overhear conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. In the barracks, some of her male counterparts would make jokes just loud enough for her to hear, comments about diversity quotas and lowered standards. But it was recruit Thompson, a former high school football star from Texas who weighed over 200 pounds, who decided to voice what some of the others were thinking. "I don't know why they let girls in here," he said loudly during one evening's free time. "This isn't about being mean, it's about reality. When the shooting starts, I need to know the person next to me can carry their weight. Can carry my weight if I'm wounded." Sarah looked up from the letter she was writing to her parents, meeting Thompson's eyes directly.
"You're right," she said quietly. "When the shooting starts, you need to know you can depend on the person next to you." She folded her letter carefully and stood up.
"So maybe you should worry less about whether I can carry your weight, and more about whether you can keep up." Thompson laughed, a sound that echoed through the barracks.
"Keep up, Princess? I was squatting more weight than you weigh when I was 15 years old." The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the doorway.
"What's all this chatter? You ladies having a tea party?"
"Martinez. Thompson."
Outside now. As they stood at attention in the cool evening air, Rodriguez studied both recruits carefully.
"You two seem to have some kind of disagreement," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I think it's time we settled this scientifically. Tomorrow morning, 0500 hours, you're both going to participate in a little extra training exercise I like to call putting your money where your mouth is. The rest of your platoon will be there to watch."
That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sound of 59 other recruits sleeping. She wasn't nervous about the morning's challenge. She had faced down doubt and skepticism her entire life. What bothered her was the realization that proving herself to Thompson wouldn't be enough. There would always be another Thompson, Another test. Another person who looked at her and saw only what she wasn't instead of what she was. The next morning, before dawn, the entire platoon gathered around an obstacle course that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had apparently constructed in the darkness. It was a brutal combination of rope climbing, log carrying, low crawling under barbed wire, and a final sprint that covered nearly 2 miles of varied terrain.
"Here's how this works," Rodriguez announced to the assembled recruits. "Martinez and Thompson are going to run this course. Whoever finishes first wins. But here's the catch. The loser's entire platoon runs the course again after chow. So if you're smart, you'll be cheering for both of them." Thompson stretched and flexed, playing to the crowd of recruits who were clearly expecting him to dominate the smaller girl. He had size, strength, and speed advantages that seemed insurmountable. Sarah simply checked her bootlaces and rolled her shoulders, mentally preparing for what she knew would be the most watched few minutes of her military career so far. The whistle blew, and both recruits sprinted toward the first obstacle. Thompson's longer stride gave him an immediate advantage, and he reached the rope climb a full 5 seconds before Sarah. The assembled platoon cheered as he powered up the rope using primarily upper body strength, his technique brutal but effective. Sarah approached the rope differently. Instead of trying to muscle her way up, she used a technique she had learned from rock climbing videos she had watched for free at the public library. Her legs did most of the work, wrapping around the rope in a way that conserved her upper body strength while maintaining steady upward progress. By the time Thompson reached the top, Sarah was only 3 seconds behind. The log carry was next, a 100-pound tree trunk that had to be transported 50 yards before being dropped at the next obstacle. Thompson's raw strength advantage was obvious here, and he extended his lead significantly. But Sarah noticed something that the cheering spectators missed. Thompson was breathing hard, burning through his energy reserves at an unsustainable pace. The low crawl under barbed wire was where Sarah began to make up ground. Her smaller stature was actually an advantage here, allowing her to maintain speed while staying low enough to avoid the sharp wire above. Thompson, meanwhile, was forced to practically slither on his belly, his broad shoulders making the passage awkward and slow. By the time they reached the final sprint, Sarah had pulled even with Thompson, and both recruits could hear their platoon mates screaming encouragement. But this was where Sarah's true advantage revealed itself. While Thompson's earlier burst of speed had depleted his energy reserves, Sarah felt like she was just hitting her stride. The 2-mile run that followed was exactly the kind of sustained effort that had made her legendary in high school. Thompson started strong, pulling ahead in the first quarter mile. But Sarah remained patient, maintaining a steady pace that she knew she could sustain. At the half-mile mark, Thompson's lead began to shrink. At the mile mark, they were even again. With half a mile to go, Sarah pulled ahead, and Thompson's labored breathing made it clear that he had nothing left in reserve. Sarah crossed the finish line 15 seconds ahead of Thompson, but instead of celebrating, she immediately jogged back to where he had collapsed, hands on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. "Good race," she said, offering him her hand. "You pushed me harder than I've been pushed in a while." Thompson looked up at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and something that might have been respect. He took her hand and let her help him to his feet. "I don't understand," he said between gasps. "How did you? You're half my size." Sarah shrugged. "Size isn't everything. Besides, you gave up about 1.5 miles ago." "I could hear it in your breathing." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had watched the entire competition in silence, but now he stepped forward. "Outstanding performance, both of you." "Martinez, that was some of the finest pacing I've seen from a recruit." "Thompson, you showed guts even when you were clearly beaten." He paused, looking at the assembled platoon. "I hope the rest of you learned something here today. In combat, it's not always the biggest or the strongest who survives. It's the person who refuses to quit when quitting would be easier." 3. From that day forward, the dynamic in the platoon shifted dramatically. Thompson became one of Sarah's most vocal supporters, often stepping in when new recruits made the same assumptions about her capabilities that he had initially made. But more importantly, Sarah began to understand that her greatest challenge wouldn't be proving herself to skeptics. It would be helping others expand their definition of what a Marine could be. The weeks that followed brought increasingly difficult challenges, each one designed to push recruits beyond what they thought were their limits. Sarah excelled at almost everything, but it was her performance during the combat simulation exercises that truly set her apart. While other recruits panicked under pressure or became overwhelmed by the chaos of mock battles, Sarah displayed an almost supernatural calm. During one particularly intense exercise, Sarah's squad was pinned down by simulated enemy fire, with several wounded members who needed to be evacuated.
The scenario was designed to test leadership and decision-making under pressure, and most recruits either froze or made rash decisions that led to more casualties. Sarah assessed the situation with the methodical approach she had learned from years of managing family crises on a tight budget.
She identified the safest evacuation route, organized the remaining squad members into an efficient rescue team, and personally carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety while coordinating the entire operation. Her performance was so exceptional that the drill instructors reviewing the exercise initially thought there had been some kind of mistake in the scenario design.
But it was during the final week of boot camp that Sarah faced her greatest test, the Crucible, a 54-hour field exercise that serves as the final examination for Marine recruits, is designed to push trainees to their absolute physical and mental limits. Recruits are given minimal food and sleep while completing a series of challenges that test everything they have learned over the previous 12 weeks. Sarah's platoon began the Crucible at dawn on a Wednesday, each recruit carrying full combat gear and supplies for the 3-day exercise. The first challenge involved navigating difficult terrain while carrying heavy equipment, and several recruits began struggling within the first few hours. The combination of sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and constant pressure began breaking down even the strongest members of the platoon. By the second day, 3 recruits had been medically removed from the exercise due to injuries and exhaustion. The remaining recruits were pushed beyond anything they had experienced during their civilian lives, and the stress was beginning to show in arguments, mistakes, and breakdowns in teamwork. It was during the second night, as the platoon attempted to complete a complex obstacle course in darkness, that disaster struck. Recruit Williams, one of the larger men in the platoon, miscalculated a jump between platforms and fell badly, clearly injuring his leg. The drill instructors watching from a distance made no move to intervene. Part of the Crucible was learning to handle emergencies without outside help. Williams was clearly in severe pain and unable to continue, but the platoon had been told that failure to complete the course as a unit would result in everyone starting the Crucible over from the beginning. Tensions were running high, food was scarce, and several recruits began arguing about what to do with Williams. "We can't carry him through the rest of this," one recruit argued. "He's going to slow us all down, and we'll all fail because of one person." "But we can't leave him behind either," Thompson countered. "Marines don't abandon Marines."
As the argument escalated, Sarah knelt beside Williams, quickly assessing his injury.
His ankle was badly twisted, possibly fractured, and he was clearly in significant pain. But more importantly, she could see the defeat in his eyes, the look of someone who believed he was about to let down everyone around him. "Listen to me," Sarah said to Williams, her voice calm and authoritative. "This isn't over. We're going to get you through this, all of us together." She looked up at the rest of the platoon, who had stopped arguing to listen. "Thompson, I need you to help me fashion a splint from those tree branches." "Rodriguez," she said to another recruit, "start redistributing Williams's gear among the rest of us. Everyone else, figure out how we can modify our approach to the obstacles to accommodate someone with limited mobility." What followed was one of the most remarkable displays of teamwork and problem-solving that the drill instructors had ever witnessed during a Crucible exercise. Sarah essentially became the platoon's field commander, coordinating a complex operation that allowed them to continue moving forward while ensuring that Williams remained an active part of the team rather than simply dead weight to be carried. She redesigned their approach to each obstacle, finding ways for Williams to contribute despite his injury. When they reached barriers that required climbing, Sarah organized human pyramids that allowed Williams to be lifted and lowered safely. When they encountered water crossings, she figured out how to use rope and teamwork to get everyone across without putting additional strain on Williams's injured leg. Most remarkably, Sarah managed to do all of this while maintaining the pace required to complete the Crucible on schedule. Her ability to think strategically while performing physically demanding tasks impressed even the most skeptical drill instructors. The final morning of the Crucible concluded with a 9-mile hike back to the base, carrying full gear plus the weight of Williams's equipment distributed among the platoon. As they crested the final hill and saw the base spread out below them, Sarah's platoon was exhausted but unified in a way that none of them had experienced before. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been observing the entire exercise, fell into step beside Sarah as they descended toward the finish line. "Martinez," he said quietly, "in 15 years of running Crucibles, I have never seen anything like what you did back there. You didn't just complete the exercise, you elevated everyone around you." Sarah, despite her exhaustion, managed a small smile. "That's what Marines do, right? We take care of each other." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Some recruits graduate from boot camp as Marines. Others graduate as leaders. And a very few graduate as something special." He paused, watching as Sarah helped Williams maintain his footing on the steep descent.
I have a feeling we're going to be hearing a lot more about you, Marine Martinez. 3 days later, Sarah Martinez stood with her fellow graduates at the completion ceremony, officially earning the title of United States Marine. Her parents had driven down from Delano to watch their daughter's transformation, and they'd barely recognized the confident, composed young woman who stood at attention in her dress blues. But even as she celebrated this achievement with her family, Sarah knew that boot camp had been just the beginning.
The real test of her abilities would come when she reached her first duty assignment, where she would have to prove herself all over again to a new group of skeptics who would see only a small girl from a farm worker family.
Never imagining that they were looking at someone who would soon redefine their understanding of what it meant to be truly exceptional. Sarah's first assignment took her to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where she was assigned to the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force as part of a logistics unit.
It wasn't the glamorous combat role that many young Marines dreamed of. But Sarah understood that every position in the Corps served a critical function. Besides, she had learned long ago that opportunity often came disguised as ordinary work. The logistics unit was commanded by Captain James Morrison, a career Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested in real combat. When Sarah reported for duty, Morrison barely glanced up from his paperwork, simply pointing her towards Sergeant First Class Davis, who would be her immediate supervisor. Davis was a 20-year veteran who ran the logistics operation with military precision and had little patience for new Marines who thought they knew better than their seniors.
He looked at Sarah's slight frame and soft-spoken manner and immediately categorized her as someone who would probably request a transfer to a desk job within 6 months.
Martinez, Davis said without preamble, your job is to manage equipment inventories and coordinate supply convoys.
It's not exciting work, but it's important. Marines in the field depend on us to get them what they need, when they need it, where they need it. You screw up here, people die out there. Understood? Understood, Sergeant, Sarah replied crisply.
What Davis didn't expect was that Sarah would approach logistics with the same systematic thinking that had made her successful at everything else. Within her first month, she had identified inefficiencies in the supply chain that had been costing the unit both time and money.
She created new inventory tracking systems that reduced equipment losses and streamlined the process of getting critical supplies to Marines in the field. But it was during a routine convoy escort mission that Sarah first demonstrated the combat potential that would eventually make her legendary. The mission was supposed to be simple: escort supply trucks through a 30-mile stretch of rural North Carolina during a training exercise, protecting them from simulated enemy attacks staged by other Marine units playing the role of insurgents. Sarah was assigned as the assistant gunner in the lead vehicle, primarily because someone needed to handle radio communications while the more experienced Marines focused on tactics and strategy. The convoy consisted of 5 vehicles carrying everything from ammunition to medical supplies, protected by a dozen Marines who had all seen real combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. 20 miles into the mission, the convoy was hit by the first simulated attack. The opposing force had set up an ambush in a wooded area, using blank ammunition and simulated explosive devices to create a realistic combat scenario. The plan was to test the convoy's response to a coordinated assault from multiple directions. What happened next would be talked about in Marine training circles for years to come. As the convoy came under simulated fire from 3 different positions, Sarah immediately began analyzing the tactical situation with a clarity that impressed even the seasoned veterans around her. While the other Marines responded according to their training, following established protocols for convoy defense, Sarah was already 3 steps ahead, anticipating the enemy's next moves. "The sergeant," she called out to Davis over the radio, "the primary ambush is coming from our 2 o'clock, but they've got flanking positions at 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock. They're trying to box us in and force us into that clearing ahead, where they probably have their main force waiting." Davis, who was commanding the convoy from the 3rd vehicle, was initially annoyed by the unsolicited tactical analysis from a Marine who was supposed to be handling communications. "Martinez, stick to your assigned duties," he responded curtly. But 30 seconds later, when the simulated enemy forces moved exactly as Sarah had predicted, Davis's opinion began to shift. The opposing force emerged from concealed positions at the clearing ahead, attempting to complete the tactical box that would have trapped the entire convoy. "All units," Davis commanded over the radio, "alter course to avoid the clearing." Martinez called it, "We're walking into a trap." What followed was a running battle that lasted for over an hour, with the convoy attempting to reach its destination while under constant pressure from a determined and well-coordinated opposing force. Throughout the engagement, Sarah continued to provide tactical analysis that proved remarkably accurate,
predicting enemy movements and suggesting countermeasures that repeatedly kept the convoy one step ahead of its attackers.
But it was during the final phase of the exercise that Sarah truly distinguished herself. The convoy had successfully avoided the main ambush and was approaching its destination when the opposing force launched one final desperate attack.
A squad of Marines playing the role of insurgents had positioned themselves in a building that commanded the only road to the convoy's objective, and their simulated heavy machine gun made it impossible for the vehicles to proceed. The standard response would have been to call for air support or artillery to neutralize the position, but this was a training exercise with limited resources and time constraints. The convoy was facing the possibility of failing its mission unless someone could find a way to neutralize the enemy position quickly and efficiently. Sarah studied the tactical situation for several minutes, noting the terrain features, the enemy's probable fields of fire, and the available cover and concealment.
Then, she made a suggestion that initially seemed insane to the experienced Marines around her. "Sergeant Davis," she called over the radio. "I think I can take out that position, but I'll need to move on foot with a small team." Davis almost laughed out loud.
"Martinez, those are experienced Marines up there, and they've got the high ground and superior firepower. What makes you think you can succeed where a full frontal assault would fail?" "Because they're not expecting what I have in mind," Sarah replied calmly. "They're positioned to defend against a vehicle-based attack or a conventional infantry assault. But there's a drainage ditch that runs from our position to within 50 meters of their building. If I can get close enough without being detected, I can neutralize their position from an angle they're not covering." The plan was risky and unconventional, exactly the kind of creative thinking that either resulted in spectacular success or spectacular failure. Davis hesitated, knowing that if Sarah's plan went wrong, it could result in the entire convoy failing its mission. But something in her voice, the same calm confidence she had displayed throughout the exercise, convinced him to give her a chance. Sarah selected 2 volunteers from the convoy security team, Marines who were willing to trust her tactical instincts despite her lack of combat experience. Together, they began a careful infiltration of the enemy position, moving through the drainage ditch that Sarah had identified as their route of approach. The movement took over 40 minutes, with Sarah leading her small team through terrain that required them to crawl on their bellies while remaining completely silent. The Marines observing the exercise were amazed by Sarah's ability to navigate difficult ground while maintaining perfect noise discipline, skills that typically took years of specialized training to develop.